What happens when a wealthy cattle baron tries to crush a poor farmer's pride in front of a whole town, thinking money can buy anything? Picture a dusty saloon where a simple spat kicks off, only to turn into a tale folks will whisper about around campfires for years. And what if, just when power and gold seemed untouchable, fate pulled a trick so slick even a coyote couldn't see it coming? 'Cause out here in the Wild West, truth don't always fire a colt. Sometimes it just leads the herd off into the dark, leaving nothing but murmurs and laughter. Stick around to hear how one night flipped a backwater town upside down. Hey there, folks. How you holding up? Where you listening from? The last light of day was fading fast as Jack Carson nudged open the swinging doors of the saloon in the scrappy town of Dry Creek. His boots, caked with the kind of dust that never quits the desert, left faint trails on the uneven floorboards. The air inside carried the sharp sting of cheap whiskey, the musk of unwashed men, and tobacco so brittle it could have been ground from the rocks outside. Around the tables voices rumbled, gruff talk of cattle drives, busted poker hands, and who'd outride who on a good horse. Jack, in his threadbare shirt and a hat that'd been through too many summers, eased onto a bar stool. He wasn't much for small talk, but the saloon was the one spot in Dry Creek where a man could sit without someone trying to swindle him or pull a trigger. The barkeep, a lean man named Amos with a mustache that seemed to have a life of its own, pushed a glass of watery whiskey toward Jack. "Heard the gossip, Carson?" Amos asked, resting his elbows on the counter, his voice low, like he was passing along a warning. "Folks are saying you're a patch of dirt ain't worth keeping. Say you're too broke to make it anything but a joke." Jack took a slow pull from his glass, the liquor scraping his throat like sandpaper. He set it down, fingers drumming lightly on the scarred wood. "Let 'em jaw, Amos," he said, his tone calm but edged with a bite. "They got plenty of hot air, but I got patience." Over by the card tables, a handful of ranch hands, their faces flushed from booze and too much sun, didn't bother whispering. Carson's land ain't fit for nothing but lizards. One of 'em, a wiry fella named Pete, sneered, slapping down a card. "Man's too bullheaded to sell, too poor to grow a damn thing." Another, a burly guy with a scar running down his jaw, let out a laugh that shook the room. "He's just sitting there, like a vulture waiting for rain that ain't coming." The table roared and a few eyes flicked toward Jack, waiting for a reaction. He didn't give him one. He just leaned back, a faint grin tugging at his mouth, not quite reaching his eyes. "Dirt's dirt," he called out, loud enough to carry. "Least mine don't come with a side of lies, unlike some folks' deals." The laughter fizzled out, replaced by a couple of uneasy coughs. Jack wasn't one for long speeches, but his words hit like a well-placed jab. He finished his drink, tossed a few coins beside the empty glass, and stood, his chair scraping against the floor. The saloon went quiet, the kind of hush that trails a man who don't care for your opinion, but makes you wonder what's brewing in his head. "Reckon I'll catch y'all tomorrow," Jack said, tipping his hat just enough to be civil. "Unless one of you's buying me a better bottle." A few men smirked, but no one took the bait. Jack stepped out into the chilly night, leaving the saloon to its rumors and Dry Creek to its chatter. He'd heard sharper barbs than theirs before, and he knew talk was worth less than the dust on his boots. The morning sun burned hot over Dry Creek as Walter Clayton's wagon rolled into town, its wheels kicking up dust that hung like a grudge in the air. His men, all sharp-eyed and armed, flanked him on horseback, their spurs jingling with every step. Clayton, a man whose wealth was measured in cattle and arrogance, sat tall, his tailored coat out of place among the town's weathered boards. He'd built his empire on land others couldn't hold, and his eyes, cold as a snake's, were fixed on Jack Carson's scrappy patch of earth. Jack was out there now, mending a fence with wire so old it might have been older than him, when Clayton's shadow fell across the posts. "Carson!" Clayton's voice boomed, loud enough to startle a pair of crows off a nearby tree. He leaned forward, his mustache twitching like it was itching for a fight. "You're squatting on land that could feed my herd. Pack up your junk and clear out by sundown." A crowd had gathered, shopkeepers, loafers, even a stray dog, drawn by the spectacle like moths to a lantern. Jack straightened slow, wiping sweat from his brow, his hammer still in hand. He looked Clayton square in the eye, his face calm as a still pond. "All that money, Walter," he said, his voice low but clear, "and you still can't buy a man's sleep. This land's mine, fair and square." The crowd murmured, some chuckling at Jack's nerve, others whispering that he was poking a bear with a dull stick. Clayton's face reddened, his jaw tight as a coiled spring. He swung down from his wagon, boots hitting the ground hard, and pointed a gloved finger at Jack. "You're a fool, Carson," he spat, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "My boys'll run you off this dirt before the moon's up. Ain't no place here for a broke dreamer." His men shifted in their saddles, hands resting on holsters, waiting for a nod. Jack just tipped his hat, a slow, deliberate move. "Reckon we'll see what the night brings, then," he said, turning back to his fence, like Clayton wasn't worth another word. The crowd dispersed, buzzing with the kind of excitement that comes when a storm's brewing. Clayton climbed back into his wagon, his men trailing him like shadows, but his glare stayed on Jack's back. The townsfolk knew Clayton didn't make idle threats. His word was law in Dry Creek, backed by money and muscle. Jack, though, kept hammering at his fence, each strike steady as a heartbeat. He didn't look like a man who'd been but in a town where gold called the shots. Standing tall could cost more than a poor man could pay. By sundown, the saloon in Dry Creek was packed tighter than a cattle car, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the buzz of gossip. Lanterns cast flickering shadows on the walls, where men leaned close, their voices a mix of laughter and hushed speculation about the day's showdown. Jack Carson's name was on every tongue, his quiet defiance against Walter Clayton fuel for the night's chatter. At a corner table, a group of card players paused their game, their cards forgotten as they traded bets on how long Jack would hold out. The barkeep, Amos, polished glasses with a rag that looked older than the town, his ears catching every word. "Carson's got guts, I'll give him that," said a wiry cowboy named Hank, nursing a warm beer. "But going up against Clayton? That's like spitting into a twister," the table laughed. But a gray-haired rancher, his face creased like old leather, shook his head. "Jack ain't dumb. He's playing a game we ain't seen yet." Across the room, a young fella with a patchy beard leaned forward, grinning. "Hey, Carson, you planning to sleep under a cactus now?" The crowd chuckled, eyes turning to Jack, who sat alone at the bar, his whiskey glass half empty. He didn't flinch, just ran a finger along the rim of his glass. "Long as my conscience don't itch worse than my saddle, I'll sleep fine," he said, his voice steady, cutting through the noise like a knife. The laughter faded, replaced by a few nods and awkward glances. Jack's words had a way of making folks rethink their jabs. Amos leaned over the counter, lowering his voice. "You sure you want to poke that bear, Jack? Clayton's got the sheriff in his pocket, and enough men to run you out by dawn." Jack's eyes met his, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Let him try, Amos. Ain't no law says a man can't stand his ground." He drained his glass and stood, his boots thudding against the floorboards. The saloon watched as he walked out, the door swinging shut behind him, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the heat outside. Outside, the night was cool, the stars sharp against the black sky. The town was still humming with Clayton's threat, but Jack's calm had stirred something else, a flicker of doubt about who'd come out on top. Folks didn't know whether to bet on the rich man's muscle or the poor man's nerve. Either way, Dry Creek was starting to feel like a pot about to boil over. The moon hung low over the canyon just outside Dry Creek, its pale light carving sharp shadows across the rocky walls. Jack Carson had ridden out here after leaving the saloon, his old mare plodding along a trail only he seemed to know. He set up camp on a flat ledge, the kind of spot where the wind whispered secrets and the stars felt close enough to touch. His bedroll was thin, his fire small, just enough to warm a tin of beans. The distant lowing of cattle, Clayton's heard no doubt, drifted through the night, a reminder of the trouble brewing back in town. Jack leaned against a boulder, his hat tipped low, chewing on a piece of jerky tough as boot leather. He'd heard the saloon's laughter, felt the weight of Clayton's threat. But out here, with only the canyon for company, those things seemed small. Folks talk big when they're safe behind a bar, he muttered to his horse, who snorted like she agreed. He pulled a worn knife from his belt and started whittling a stick, the slow scrape of steel on wood keeping time with his thoughts. Something about the night felt different, like the air was holding its breath, waiting for a spark. The faint sound of hooves crunching gravel made Jack pause, his hand stilling on the knife. He didn't look up, but his ears caught every shift in the darkness. Could have been a coyote. Could have been one of Clayton's men sniffing around. He waited silent until the sound faded into the wind. "Reckon you're not that stupid, Walter," he said under his breath, a wry grin tugging at his mouth. He tossed the stick into the fire, watching the flames lick it up. Tomorrow's going to be a hell of a day. As he settled into his bedroll, the canyon seemed to hum with a quiet promise. Jack didn't know what the morning would bring, but he'd learned long ago that the desert had a way of settling scores. He closed his eyes, the distant cattle calls fading into the rhythm of the night. Back in Dry Creek, folks might have been betting against him, but out here, under a sky too big for any man's wallet, Jack felt like the odds weren't half bad. Dawn broke over Dry Creek with a commotion that could wake a dead man. The town square was chaos, men shouting, horses snorting, and dust swirling like a storm had rolled in overnight. Word spread faster than a brush fire. Walter Clayton's prized herd, thousands of cattle strong, had vanished into the night. Not a single hoof print led anywhere clear, as if the desert itself had opened up and swallowed them whole. By mid-morning, Clayton was in the street, his face purple with rage, barking orders at his men, who looked more spooked than their horses. Jack Carson, meanwhile, was at his run-down shack, calmly patching a hole in his old saddle. The leather was cracked, but he worked it with steady hands, humming a tune no one in Dry Creek would have recognized. A crowd started to gather near his fence, folks drawn by the news and curious to see if Jack was sweating under Clayton's shadow. The sheriff, a stocky man named Hollis with a badge that shone brighter than his courage, rode up, his horse kicking up more dust. "Carson," Hollis called, squinting against the sun, "you know anything about Clayton's cattle going missing?" Jack didn't look up, just kept stitching. "Heard they took a walk," he said, his voice dry as the ground. "Reckon they got tired of his yellin'." The crowd snickered, but Hollis wasn't amused. He leaned forward in his saddle, his hand resting on his holster. "Folks are saying you were out in that canyon last night, Jack. Mighty convenient. You being so close to where those cows were grazing." Jack finally raised his eyes, his gaze steady, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Sheriff, I was sleeping under the stars, not herding someone else's stock. You want to check my bedroll for cow dung? Be my guest." A few onlookers laughed outright, and Hollis's face tightened, but he had nothing solid to pin on Jack. He muttered something about keeping an eye out and rode off, leaving the crowd to whisper among themselves. As the sun climbed higher, the town buzzed with theories. Rustlers, bad luck, or maybe Clayton's own men botched the job. Jack went back to his saddle, his hands moving like nothing had changed. But the air in Dry Creek felt different now, like a storm was brewing, and Jack's calm was starting to look less like stubbornness and more like a man who knew something the rest of them didn't. The afternoon sun beat down on Dry Creek, turning the streets into a haze of heat and whispered accusations. By now, every porch and saloon corner buzzed with talk of Clayton's missing cattle, and Jack Carson's name was tangled up in the mess like a burr in a horse's mane. Folks gathered in clumps, their voices low but sharp, tossing around theories as freely as poker chips. Some swore Jack had rustled the herd out of spite. Others figured he was too broke to pull off something that bold. Either way, the town was starting to look at him less like a fool and more like a fox in a henhouse. At the general store, a group of old-timers sat chewing tobacco, their chairs creaking under the weight of their gossip. "Carson's got no men, no money," said one, spitting into the dirt, "but he's got nerve. Maybe he paid some drifters to move that herd." A woman in a faded bonnet shook her head, clutching a sack of flour. "Ain't like Jack to steal, but he's got a way of making folks mad without trying." Across town, Walter Clayton stormed into the sheriff's office, his boots pounding the floorboards. "Arrest Carson," he bellowed, slamming a fist on Hollis's desk. "He's behind this. I know it." Hollis, wiping sweat from his brow, leaned back in his chair. "Walter, I checked his place. Man was sleeping in the canyon last night. Unless he's got wings, he didn't move your cows." Jack, meanwhile, was at his fence again, hammering nails into a post with the same steady rhythm as always. A few kids lingered nearby, tossing pebbles and whispering about the cow thief. One, braver than the rest, called out, "Hey, Jack, you hide them cows in your hat?" Jack paused, wiped his forehead, and grinned. "Kid, if I could fit a herd in here, I'd be richer than Clayton ever dreamed." The kids laughed, scattering like sparrows, but the adults, watching from a distance, weren't so quick to smile. Clayton's men rode by, their eyes hard, scanning Jack's every move. He didn't flinch, just kept hammering, each strike sounding like a challenge to the town's suspicions. Dry Creek was splitting down the middle. Some saw Jack as a troublemaker, others as a man who'd been pushed too far. The truth was still out there, lost in the dust, but Jack's calm was starting to feel like a signal fire, drawing every eye in town to whatever he'd do next. The sun was a merciless blaze over the sprawling plains outside Dry Creek as a ragtag posse of Clayton's men fanned out, scouring the desert for his missing herd. Dust clung to their sweat-soaked shirts, and their horses snorted in protest, hooves kicking up clouds that stung the eyes. Sheriff Hollis rode at the front, his badge glinting dully, though he looked more like a man chasing ghosts than cattle. The trails led nowhere. Faint tracks vanished into rocky patches, and the few cow patties they found were too old to mean much. By noon, the men were cursing, their canteens running low and their tempers running high. Back in town, Jack Carson was mending a broken plow, his hands steady despite the whispers circling like vultures. A few townsfolk lingered nearby, pretending to tend to chores but stealing glances at him. "They're combing the whole damn territory," one man muttered, leaning on a fence post. "Ain't no way that herd just up and walked off." Jack kept his eyes on his work, but his ears caught every word. He drove a nail into the plow with a single hard swing. "Nature's got a funny way of balancing things," he said, loud enough for the loiterers to hear. "Maybe them cows found a better boss." Clayton's men returned as the sun dipped low, their faces grim and empty-handed. One, a burly rider named Tom, kicked a rock in frustration outside the saloon. "It's like the damn ground ate 'em," he growled to a small crowd. "No tracks, no signs, nothing." A woman nearby, sweeping her porch, smirked. Maybe the desert don't like greedy men. The crowd chuckled, but Tom's glare silenced them quick. Clayton himself paced outside his big house, on the hill, his shouts carrying down to the streets. "I'll find those cattle," he vowed, "and whoever took 'em will wish they'd never set foot in Dry Creek." Jack, wiping grease from his hands, overheard the commotion from his yard. He didn't say a word, just picked up his plow and moved it to the shed, his steps slow and deliberate. The town was starting to feel the weight of Clayton's anger, but Jack's quiet work carried a different kind of weight. Like a man who knew the desert kept secrets better than any thief ever could. As the posse regrouped for another day's search, Dry Creek buzzed with a sense that something bigger than cattle was at stake. The mood in Dry Creek had shifted by the time the sun rose again, like a wind changing direction before a storm. Walter Clayton's missing herd wasn't just news anymore. It was a wound, and the town was poking at it with gleeful whispers. Outside the saloon, men swapped stories over cigarettes, their laughter sharper than it had been days ago. "Clayton's losing his grip," one rancher said, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "Man thought he owned the damn desert, but it's laughing at him now." A shopkeeper, sweeping his stoop, added, Heard some say it's God's own justice, stripping a man too big for his boots. Inside the saloon, the talk was bolder. A wiry gambler, shuffling cards, grinned at his table. Maybe them cows just followed a better trail, one that don't lead to Clayton's pockets. The room chuckled, and even Amos, the barkeep, let out a snort as he wiped down the counter. The tide was turning. Folks who once Tippedonia. Nature don't care much for money, Jack said, his voice dry as the dirt outside, but it sure knows how to pick its fights. The crowd's laughter wasn't aimed at Jack anymore. He was no longer just the broke farmer clinging to worthless land. At the market, a woman buying cloth paused to whisper to her friend, "Carson's got the whole town thinking he outsmarted Clayton somehow." Jack, sitting on his porch sharpening a knife, caught the stares of passers-by. A kid tossing a stick called out, "Hey Jack, you teach them cows to run yet?" Jack didn't look up, just kept scraping steel against steel. "Didn't need to," he said, his grin sly. They learned that lesson all on their own. Clayton's name was now the punchline, his rage a spectacle folks retold with embellished relish. The story grew wilder with each telling. Some swore the herd had been spirited away by ghosts, others that the cows had simply chosen freedom over Clayton's whip. Jack's calm defiance, once mocked, was now the spark of every tale. Dry Creek was starting to see him as something new. Not a fool, but a quiet storm that had somehow turned the tables without firing a shot. The noon sun baked Dry Creek's main street, turning the air into a shimmering haze as Walter Clayton stormed toward Jack Carson's shack. His boots kicked up dust with every furious step, his face twisted like he'd swallowed a hornet. A small crowd trailed him, drawn by the promise of a showdown, their whispers buzzing like flies. Clayton's men flanked him, their hands twitching near their holsters, but the town's eyes were on Jack, who was leaning against his fence, whittling a stick with a knife that glinted in the light. He didn't look up as Clayton stopped a few paces away, his shadow long and mean. "Carson!" Clayton's voice cracked like a whip, loud enough to hush the street. "You think you can make a fool out of me? I know you had a hand in my herd disappearing." Jack kept whittling, the slow scrape of his blade steady as a heartbeat. He finally raised his eyes, his face calm but sharp at the edges. "Walter, your cows didn't need my help to walk away from a man like you," he said, his words dripping with a quiet sting. "Greed's a heavy leash. Maybe it snapped." The crowd gasped, a few stifling laughs. Clayton's face went from red to purple, his hand jerking toward his belt before he caught himself. "You're a dead man. If I find one shred of proof," he snarled, stepping closer, his men shifting like wolves ready to pounce. Jack set his knife down, slow and deliberate, and stood, his lean frame taller than it seemed moments ago. "Proof's a funny thing, Walter," he said, his voice low but clear. "You can't buy it, and you sure can't scare it out of the dirt." The crowd murmured, some nodding, their fear of Clayton fading in the face of Jack's steady nerve. A woman in the crowd, clutching a basket, whispered to her neighbor, "He's got Clayton looking like a fool without lifting a finger." A shopkeeper nearby chuckled, and the sound spread, soft but sharp, like a spark catching dry grass. Clayton's men glanced at each other, uneasy, as the laughter grew. For the first time, the Bogach stood alone, his power cracking under the weight of a town that was starting to see through him. Jack picked up his knife again, resuming his whittling, as if Clayton's threats were just dust on the wind. The streets stayed tense, but the balance had shifted. Dry Creek was watching a new kind of fight, one where words cut deeper than bullets. The tension in Dry Creek snapped like a brittle twig underfoot as Walter Clayton stood in the street, his eyes wild with fury. The crowd had swelled, shopkeepers and ranch hands alike, drawn to the spectacle, their murmurs a low hum against the midday heat. Clayton's hand hovered over his revolver, his knuckles white, as he glared at Jack Carson, who leaned casually against his fence, still holding that damn whittling knife. The air felt thick, like the moment before a lightning strike, and every soul in town knew something was about to give. "You think you're untouchable, Carson?" Clayton roared, his voice shaking with a mix of rage and desperation. "I'll bury you in your dirt patch." He yanked his revolver free, the barrel glinting as he aimed it at Jack's chest. The crowd gasped, stepping back, but Jack didn't flinch. He set his knife down, slow as ever, and raised his hands, not in surrender, but like a man sizing up a rattler. "Pull that trigger, Walter," Jack said, his voice steady as stone, "and you'll prove you're smaller than your wallet." The words landed like a slap, and a few in the crowd stifled nervous laughs. Sheriff Hollis shoved through the onlookers, his badge catching the sun as he planted himself between the two men. "Put it down, Clayton," he barked, his hand on his own gun but his eyes wary. "Ain't no law let you shoot a man for talkin'." Clayton's arm trembled, his face a mask of humiliation as the crowd's whispers turned to open chuckles. A woman called out, "He's right, Walter. Your cows ran, not Jack." The laughter spread, bold now, and Clayton's men shifted uneasily, their loyalty wavering under the town's gaze. For the first time, Clayton looked around, seeing not fear but mockery in the faces he'd once owned. Jack stepped forward, his hands still raised, his eyes locked on Clayton's. "You built your kingdom on sand, Walter," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "It's slipping away, and you know it." The crowd roared, some clapping, others shouting support for Jack. Clayton lowered his gun, his shoulders sagging, the fight draining out of him like water from a cracked bucket. He turned and stalked off, his men trailing like dogs with their tails tucked. Dry Creek had chosen its side, and it wasn't the man with the money. Jack picked up his knife, gave the crowd a nod, and went back to his fence, as if the world hadn't just tilted in his favor. The dust settled in Dry Creek as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky a bruised purple. Walter Clayton, once the untouchable king of the town, was now a shadow of himself, riding out alone at dawn to scour the plains for his lost herd. His fine coat was rumpled, his face etched with the kind of desperation that made men look older than their years. Folks in town watched him go, some with pity, others with smirks, as they leaned on porch rails or sipped coffee outside the general store. The man who'd ruled with money and threats was now chasing ghosts in the desert, his empire crumbling faster than a dry riverbank. Jack Carson, meanwhile, was back at his modest shack, hammering nails into a new gate, his movements as steady as ever. The townsfolk no longer lingered to mock him. Instead, they tipped their hats or offered a nod as they passed. A woman carrying a basket of apples paused by his fence. "Heard Clayton's still out there, looking for them cows," she said, her voice tinged with amusement. Jack glanced up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Man's chasing his own pride now," he replied, his grin sharp. "Hope he finds it before the coyotes do." She laughed, and the sound carried down the street, joining the growing chorus of Dry Creek's new favorite pastime, poking fun at Clayton's fall. By evening, the saloon was alive with stories, each one wilder than the last. "Clayton's gone half mad," a rancher chuckled, slamming his glass down. "Swears he saw his herd moving in the moonlight, led by nothing but air." Amos, pouring whiskey, shook his head. "Money don't buy sense, that's for damn sure." The laughter was loud, unburdened, and it felt like the town had exhaled after holding its breath too long. A new saying started to spread, whispered over card games and repeated on porches. "Cattle don't stay where folks chase off their own." It was Dry Creek's way of making sense of the mess, a jab at Clayton wrapped in desert wisdom. Jack, sitting on his porch as the stars came out, looked out at his scrappy patch of land. It wasn't much, but it was his, and it felt lighter than any ranch Clayton ever owned. He leaned back, his hands folded, and let the night's quiet wash over him. Dry Creek had found its new story, and for once, Jack wasn't the punchline. He was the man who'd outlasted the storm. Years had passed in Dry Creek, but the story of Walter Clayton's lost herd clung to the town like dust to a saddle. On cool desert nights, when campfires glowed and whiskey warmed hands, cowboys and ranchers gathered to retell the tale, their voices low and lively. The saloon, still creaking under the weight of its own history, was where the legend grew tallest. Men leaned close, their faces lit by flickering flames, adding new twists to the story. A ghostly vaquero leading the herd, or a sandstorm sent by fate itself. The truth didn't matter much anymore. The story had taken root, as much a part of Dry Creek as the canyon beyond. Jack Carson, older now, his hair streaked with gray, still lived on his modest plot, tending crops that never made him rich but kept him free. He rarely spoke of that summer, but when he did, it was with a sly grin that made folks lean in. One night, a young cowhand, barely old enough to grow a beard, sat by a fire and pressed him. "Jack, you swear you didn't touch them cows?" he asked, his eyes wide with the thrill of the tale. Jack poked at the embers, his face unreadable. "Son, I was sleeping in that canyon," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "But the desert's got a way of settling scores without asking for help." The crowd around the fire chuckled, passing a bottle, their laughter carrying into the starry night. "And then the herd just walked," an old-timer added, his voice thick with amusement, like they knew Clayton's time was up. Another swore he'd seen hoof prints vanish into thin air, though he admitted the whiskey might have helped. The tale had become Dry Creek's own myth, a warning to men who thought money could chain the land. The saying born that summer, "Cattle don't stay where folks chase off their own," was now carved into the saloon's bar, a testament to the town's newfound wisdom. Jack, leaning back against a log, let the firelight dance across his weathered face. He didn't need to add to the story. His silence said enough. Dry Creek had changed, its people a little kinder, a little wiser, and the legend of the herd that vanished was their way of keeping it that way. As the fire burned low, Jack tipped his hat to the stars, content with a truth he'd never tell. The fire in Dry Creek's tale has burned low, folks, leaving nothing but embers and a story that'll linger longer than a desert sunset. Jack Carson's quiet stand against Walter Clayton turned a dusty town upside down, proving sometimes the truth don't need a gun. It just needs a man stubborn enough to stand his ground. As the stars twinkle over this tale, we're curious about you out there, listening in. What would you have done in Jack's boots, facing down a man like Clayton? Ever seen someone turn the tables with nothing but nerve and a sharp tongue? Maybe you've got a story of your own where the underdog came out on top without firing a shot. Drop it in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what's the wildest tale you've heard round your own campfire? We're mighty grateful you rode along with us through this dusty trail. Your time, your thoughts, they mean more than a full herd to us storytellers. So, tip your hat, share your take, and let's keep the fire burning for the next tale.